Today we are concluding a series of messages that I've been sharing with you over the last couple of weeks, basically about apologetic questions. We've looked at a couple of those things up to this point in time. We started off talking about the Big Bang Theory. And if you recall, we learned there that the Big Bang Theory, because it holds that the universe began from nothing, it really is quite reflective, if you think about it, of the testimony of the book of Genesis. And what we learned in looking at that was that anything that begins to exist by a cause outside of itself. And so if the Big Bang postulates that the world began from nothing, then the explanation, the cause of that world beginning, that universe beginning, cannot be found in space, cannot be found in time, cannot be found in energy, cannot be found in matter. Why? Well, because that's what came into existence, and it cannot explain itself. We looked last week at the wonders of the DNA code. Not all of them, of course. That was quite a complicated subject matter, and we spent quite a few moments behind the pulpit dealing with it. Didn't barely scratch the surface, to tell you the honest to God truth. But what were we looking at there? Well, we have to ask the question, where did that DNA code come from? The letters in the code, if you recall us talking about this, follow a convention that doesn't have any chemical necessities. So when you look at those C's and A's and T's and G's that make up the DNA code, there's no reason for them to be where they are doing what they do. Anywhere you look around them on the DNA chain, on that molecule, there's no affinities, chemical affinities that make those things have to be there. Between the two branches on a rung in a DNA ladder, it's just a hydrogen bond. Very generic, very easy to break. If you look at the connection to the spine of the strands of the DNA code on both sides of the strands, those bonds are generic as well. There's no affinity in any of those bonding sites to any particular nucleotide. So anything could be there. I mean, if you threw a chemical soup together, threw some nucleotides in it, there is no rhyme or reason in nature itself for just any old one to be there instead of the C, the A, the T, and the G in the various orders that they are. And we also learned that there's no connection between those rungs. So there's absolutely nothing to account for the structure of the DNA code from the standpoint of chance, from the standpoint of self-organization. There's no basis to understand those kinds of things ever developing on their own from stuff. It's just not going to happen. And when you look at how DNA is used in the cell, it is absolutely so complicated, it's not even funny. We showed a little bit of that on the video clip, if you recall. I included that video clip on the link to the sermon on the Facebook page, so that if anyone didn't see it or you wanted to see the whole thing, because I only showed a few minutes of it. It's actually about 7-8 minutes long. But it's really quite amazing. You got little ribosomes there, you got other things, not the actual pictures of them, they're too small for that kind of a thing, but depictions of them and what they're doing. It's really quite astonishing and amazing. You have all these little molecular machines that are part of all of this. When you think about the unique qualities that I just mentioned about the DNA code having no chemical necessities to actually establishing that alphabet, the same holds true for RNA. So when you look at what happens inside a cell and you realize DNA is only part of the subject, then you have messenger RNA, and you have transfer RNA, and you have various other kinds of things that are all working in the bits and pieces, various enzymes and proteins, all made from DNA. Guess what? I mean, there's just no place to go with understanding how such a thing could come into being. There was a back in the 70s and 80s, a guy named Dr. Werner Gitt. he developed various theories of information, and he says, from his understanding, theories that have been put out there and really have never been debunked, never have been rebuffed, that anytime you have a code like that, its source is always intelligence. It's why we're looking for intelligence out in the great wide beyond. It's the same concept, really. Why? When you have codes that are that specific and that precise in the way that they get used, it's always a sign that intelligence is behind the development of that code. So that's what we were looking at last week, at least some of it. Today we're going to be looking at logic and reasoning and logic, and we're going to, or I should say logic and mathematics. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about logic because logic really leads us into mathematics, but we're going to spend some time talking about mathematics because mathematics, believe it or not, was not your least favorite subject in school. It's actually an incredible testimony to the existence of God, and that's what we are going to look at it as and see if we can't understand why that is the case. We're going to look at a couple of scriptures this morning. The first one that we're going to look at is out of the book of Luke. And in this particular passage of Scripture, we see God telling us something about mathematics. I think we can see it that way anyhow. This is Jesus speaking out of the Gospel of Luke chapter 14, verse number 28. He says this, "Suppose that one of you wants to build a tower. Won't you first sit down and estimate the cost to see if you have enough money to complete it?" Now, in various English translations, you'll see words like count used in this particular text instead of words like estimate or estimate. But no matter whether you use the word count or you use the word estimate, what are you doing there? You are being encouraged to use math by the Lord Jesus himself. He's saying that math is, part of our existence. It's part of a reasonable existence as a human being, and so we have that basic, that basic introduction to the subject matter there from the words of Jesus himself. The other passage of Scripture we'll look at is from the book of Isaiah, chapter 1 and verse number 18. Just a little phrase from that particular verse. And I'm not going to read it to you from the New International Version of the Bible. I actually don't like that translation in that particular area. But I do like it from other older versions, older translations of the Bible. And it's basically just this phrase, "Let us reason together." Let us reason together. Now that's an invitation from God himself, asking folks to basically sit down and have a talk with God. Not just a talk, not talking about the weather and not talking about your pets and not talking about your kids and not talking about any of those kinds of things that often conversations will be about when you're a normal human being. But God is engaging us as human beings to sit down and reason with him. In other words, there is a couple of underlying thoughts here. Number one, that God is reasonable. God is logical. And number two, we as those that God is addressing are addressed as if we are reasonable, as if we are logical. And so I would say both of those things hold, and just understanding the underpinnings of this particular phrase is that God is logical and he has made us logical. And because of that, we're able to do things like, understand mathematics, understand reason, understand argument, and all of those various kinds of things. When we talk about logic, we're really talking about reasoning. I mean, that's what it's all about. Logic is nothing more than using justifiable and reliable inference from premises to reach a conclusion. That's what logic is, right? Using justifiable and reliable inference to reach a conclusion from a premise or from premises. That's what logic is. No matter where you're dealing with logic, I mean, you can apply various kinds of logics in different kinds of circumstances and fields, but all at their base have that particular kind of equality. Now, if you think about where logic might lead you, I would say that I think that ultimately it leads you to mathematics. I would say that mathematics is a sister of logic. Logic is one thing that's talking about reasoning, and mathematics is another thing talking about reasoning. They're similar, they're related, but they're not quite the same thing. Mathematics isn't just logic, and logic certainly isn't just mathematics, even though they are closely related. Mathematics is really about numbers. So it's possible to have logic that isn't involved with numbers, but it's impossible to have mathematics be logical if it doesn't use numbers appropriately or rightly. And so mathematics is really reasoning logic that's applied to the field of numbers. Another way of saying that is maybe this: mathematics is the rules which govern the relationship between numbers. So mathematics is about how numbers relate to one another, how they connect to each other, how they in some way move from one to another. So that's the field of mathematics. That is the scope for mathematics, and so it leads to another question, does it not? We've already looked at what logic is, maybe even what reasoning is. We have some kind of a definition for mathematics that I think is helpful, but we need one more definition here before we are capable of moving on, and that's just a definition for numbers. What are numbers? Since mathematics is all about numbers, what are numbers? Numbers are not real. I mean, there are real numbers and imaginary numbers and different kinds of numbers in the field of mathematics. But when I say that numbers are not real, what I mean is that pew is real. I can go over, I can touch it, it's taking up space, it has mass. Right? I can say that the light in this room is real. Right? It's energy. Believe it or not, there is some mass involved, even though it's not discernible to us. That light is a real thing. It's the radiation that light is made up of is a real thing within space and time, within this universe in which we live. And so, those things are real. But numbers, what is a number 8? I mean, is it sitting someplace? Can you walk up and pick it up, look at it, twist it around, turn it around? What is the number 15? If you leave it out, don't put it away where it belongs, will you trip over it in the dark? No, you won't, because numbers are not real. Numbers are conceptual. Numbers exist in our mind. They have to do with quantity. They are describing a thing that can be quantified, whatever that might be, but numbers themselves are not a thing outside of your mind. Inside of your mind, a number exists, but outside of your mind, it doesn't. It's a conceptual thing with a conceptual basis. Numbers are not merely symbols. Because, you can think that way when you hear someone say that numbers are not real, that they're merely conceptual, they exist in our mind, but not necessarily do they exist outside of our minds. You might think, well, then that means that they're just symbolic. Numbers are symbolic. Well, there are symbols that we use to express numbers so that we have some kind of a way of communicating those things to one another or even manipulating them. But symbols are not the same as the number itself. That's easily enough to be proven because, when you go to different cultures, speaking different languages, using different alphabets, they have different expressions for numbers, do they not? So if you were alive during the days of the Roman Empire, your numbers would look a whole lot different than those those numbers that were used as part of the Islamic caliphate that arose later in history. We use those Arabic numerals now as our symbols, our preferred symbols for numbers, rather than Roman numbers. But at the same point in time, they're very different. And so the symbols that represent numbers are not the reality of numbers. They're not the substance of numbers. Why? Well, because they change. They can vary They're something that's made up culturally. If I was finding a way to write numbers and I lived on some isolated island far away from everybody else, my representation for numbers may look very different from anybody else's. Do they express a different concept, though? 3 is 3, whether you write it one way or you write it another way, right? 8 is 8, no matter what kind of symbol you use to represent it. The concept 8 is the concept 8. Through all culture, through all time. We would say that, that has a universal quality. If I was, on some faraway planet in some faraway galaxy, the concept 8 would be the same there that it is here. The way that you would express it, the symbol that you might use to write it down would be, who knows what. Would be very different. But the fact of 8, the concept of 8, would be the same. So numbers have this conceptual quality that they are not real. Are they real in the sense that they express something that we can find in the physical world, that we can find in the real world? Absolutely. I could count all of the people in this room, and if I did, I could assign a number to it that would have to represent some reality in describing these people. But as far as that number itself, the only place that would really exist is in my own mind, right? It doesn't exist outside of myself. Just because people come together and a number can be assigned to them, it's not like that number goes with them. Right? If you go out the door and suddenly your grouping is different, your number would be different. Because there's nothing in numbers themselves that make them real or existent in our plane. They are merely something that exists in the mind. And I think that without a mind, there can be no numbers. We often wonder, if animals can count. If animals have some kind of conception of numbers. Well, you can teach a horse a trick, to tap its hoof over a certain number of, this or that. I don't know how real that actually is. They try to train chimpanzees and birds, parrots and whatnot, to do things like count and demonstrate that they can. Do they really have a concept of numbers? That would be difficult to ascertain. My thought is they don't. Why? Because there's nothing about them that tells us they have a mind. There's nothing that tells me that they have a mind like unto us, like unto God. And so, regardless of where you look or how you look at it, basically it still comes down to this, right? Numbers are a conceptual thing. They are not something that's merely symbolic. They are not something that is subject to the whims and fancies of human beings. So, despite the fact that you might want numbers to look differently than they do in the culture that you're in, can you do something about that? Yeah, you can make your own representation for numbers, but you don't change the concept. They're universal. You have something that is universal and unchanging, but conceptual, not something that's real. How in the world can that possibly exist? My answer would be, there's got to be a mind someplace holding all of creation together in which the concept of number is present. Otherwise, I don't think that we would have the concept of number. Now, this is a truth, I think, that's really quite clear if we give it any thought at all, that numbers have this kind of quality that they only exist in mind. It takes a mind to frame them. It takes a mind to recognize them. It takes a mind to formulate them. Now, I'm not saying make them up, because as I've already demonstrated, I think numbers exist apart from the minds that recognize them. They're independent of mind. It doesn't matter if you're crazy as a loony bird. It doesn't matter if you are as ignorant as your basic American public school student. Right? They are the same, and they exist apart from the formulation of them. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter at all where you come from, who you are, about the use of numbers. They are just all because they are conceptual completely and utterly. the product of mind, and they exist in mind, and there's really no other place that they actually do exist. Now that is an interesting thing, and I said that numbers are the basis of mathematics. And I could probably just stop right there and have said enough to make a demonstration that this field of numbers and by relationship mathematics represents something that cannot be accounted for by naturalistic means. Stuff that's in nature cannot account for this, whether it's energy or whether it's matter or whether it's space or whether it's time. Those kinds of things cannot account for this. What do you need to be able to account for this? Well, you need mind, and that would be sufficient, I think, to make the step from numbers, demonstrate, and prove that there is a mind over us, there is a mind that is under us, there is a mind that is at work in all that exists. I think that in and of itself would be sufficient to demonstrate that. But I want to explore the concept a little bit more in detail, a little more depth, just to bring this into a little bit better focus. The first thing that I want to say in that regard is that mathematics, we talked about numbers, they are the basis of mathematics, but when we talk about mathematics, the interesting thing about mathematics, it seems to me, along these kinds of lines, is just this, is, math is not something that's invented by us. I think sometimes we think that way, but it's not actually the truth. You see, math is actually discovered by us. It's not invented by us, it's discovered by us. Before the first person had a thought, whoever that might have been, let's say it was Adam, right? Maybe Eve. I don't know which one was more mathematical at that point in time, right? But whoever the first one was who came up with the concept of mathematics, did the fact that 1 plus 1 equals 2, did that exist before they discovered it? Or did they make that up? Now, the first mind that came to the realization that 1 plus 1 equals 2, that person didn't invent that. That was something that was independent of them. They just stumbled into it. They were sitting down thinking about it for a while, and they realized, hey, 1 plus 1 equals 2, and it always equals 2. Doesn't matter what the one is and what the other is. 1 plus 1 always equals 2. It's just, this is a verity. This is a truth. There's the very first math, the math concept, that became inculcated in generation after generation of math students thereafter, right? The concepts of mathematics are not invented by people. We often think that that's, maybe what Isaac Newton did, or maybe Leibniz, depending on, your view of history around the 1600s. But the one thing that we do know that beyond a shadow of a doubt, a guy like Isaac Newton certainly would have to be credited with being a pioneer of the development and perhaps we would say the invention of calculus. There's virtually nothing you can do in science without calculus. Virtually nothing. You can't study physics without calculus. You cannot study electronics without calculus. You cannot study things like rockets and airplanes and the motion of air, the motion of water inside us. You can't do any of those things without, calculus is just absolutely necessary for anything that is looking at some branch of physics. It's just absolutely essential. Without it, you can't study those things. You can't apply those things. You can't find a way to get a handle on the concepts and the truth that are within those fields of study. Calculus is absolutely essential. Now, when I say that, did Newton or Leibniz, whatever your perspective is, did they actually invent calculus? Did those concepts that became calculus exist prior to those fellows? Sure they did. They absolutely did. Those things were not something that they invented. If it was something you invented, you could have invented it otherwise. I mean, isn't that true? If it's in my power to invent a thing, I can invent it this way or I can invent it that way. And if I invent it this way, then that's, what it becomes. I have a box of tissues up here. Now, technically, these are facial tissues. None of us calls them facial tissues, do we? Yeah, I mean, if you do, I would say that you're unusual. What do we generally call these things? Kleenex. And we call them Kleenex whether they're made by Kleenex or not. I mean, Kleenex is a brand. But why do we call them Kleenex? Well, Kleenex invented them as far as we know, right? And Kleenex came up with this concept and marketed this concept, and thereafter, everything that's like unto this is called Kleenex. Kleenex invented Kleenex. We can say that truly. Now, if Kleenex didn't invent this thing, could someone else have invented something similar? Would it look the same? Probably not, right? Because when we invent things, when we are the ones who produce them in that kind of a way, they can be this way or they can be that way. They're going to, in some way or another, show the fingerprint of the person that invented them. That's not true about calculus, is it? For all we know, anyone could have invented it. Would it look the same regardless of who invented it? Well, sure it would. Calculus is all about, basically at its roots, all about summations. And how patterns in summations lead you to shortcut formulations where you can play with the exponents and you can integrate, you can derive various kinds of formulas from a formula of a higher power. Why are these things helpful? Well, because you can get the area under curves. You can get the volume within things that are cubic. You can get into other dimensions, even higher dimensions, with this kind of math treatment. And it'll tell you things like volume. It'll tell you things like acceleration. It'll tell you things like speed. Various levels of derivatives and integrals and all of those kinds of formulations pop out when you apply calculus principles the right way. Fantastic thing, right? Did Isaac Newton invent it? No, he discovered it. He didn't invent it, he discovered it. There was a quality of numbers and the relationship that no one knew, no one had understood, no one had developed until Isaac Newton came along. But when Isaac Newton discovered those relationships that existed in numbers, everyone said, oh yeah, that's true, that's really cool, that works. But it was discovered, it wasn't actually invented. I think I probably have made the point, hopefully I have. Mathematics is not invented by human beings. Mathematics is discovered by human beings. The various concepts, the various truths, the various kinds of things that math involves are independent of the human mind. They exist apart from the invention of the human mind. They exist apart from the energy and the various other things that go into a human mind to produce what human minds produce. Mathematics exists independently of those things, of those considerations. So where does mathematics come from? Well, it seems like it's built into the relationship with numbers. Numbers are conceptions themselves. We've already discussed that. So where does a concept about concepts have to come from? It has to come from the thing that develops concepts. It has to come from the place where concepts live, if you will. Where is that? It's in mind. It's in mind. Mind as we as humans know it because we're made in the image of God. But you see where we're taking this, I think. Maybe you can make the leapfrog already, right? For math to exist, for numbers to exist in the way that they do, these conceptual frameworks, conceptual relationships, it must find its source in a mind. In a mind that basically put this language of mathematics in everything. Do you realize that anything that can be quantified can be treated mathematically? Something about it can be expressed through mathematics, and something about it, its relationship to other things, can be expressed by mathematics. Now we don't have that. We don't have that reality in language. Now we often say that mathematics is the language of creation, or mathematics is the language of science, things of that nature. But that kind of analogy breaks down, and I'll tell you why. Language is something that is subject to human conceptions and human minds. In other words, language, because it's just a symbolic way of expressing things that you are experiencing and observing. Your experience and your observations are what's necessary to underlie it, but the language itself is just a symbolic way to communicate it. And so when we talk about language, we have something there that is very much subject to the mind that is speaking it or writing it or using it for communication. And that's the reason why, if you think about it, there are so many languages. Now I know that we know that somehow or another Adam and Eve were expressing some kind of language, it seems, right from their creation, according to the book of Genesis. Certainly God was speaking to them in language, and so we can say, well, that too is coming from God. But the difference between language like that and mathematics is that language is still subject to the whims and fancies of the human beings that use it. I mean, we've actually invented languages purposely, things like Esperanto. Virtually every computer programming language is an effort and attempt to from whole cloth make up a language, something that didn't exist before. Some inventive human being comes up with a syntax and a symbol code for, and next thing you know, you have some definitions thrown in there for use, and you have a language. So language is something that is subject to and is made up of the inventions, if you will, of mankind. And because that is so, there's so many languages. I mean, wherever you go, there's another language. Right? If you are even Pennsylvania Dutch, how many different dialects of Pennsylvania Dutch do we have spoken in Pennsylvania? The folks out this way speak a little bit differently than the folks up in Lebanon County. Those folks speak a little bit differently than the folks down in York County and out that way, west. There's different words for things like potato, for instance. Different kinds of other different slight differences in those languages. So even in something like that, you have variation. You get to certain places like a nation like India. Now I know there's 1.4 billion people there, so that this makes sense just from the sheer numbers, in a matter of speaking. But you know, they have 17 official languages in that country. One of them being English. Although I guarantee you, if you ever have to talk to somebody at a help center, it will not appear to you that English is a first language. But the point is that English is actually one of the official languages in India, and many folks that live in India learn English from their youngest years. I mean, it's not a second language to them. It is their national language, their official language, and they speak it with a facility and that is surprising sometimes to us here in America. All those different languages. Why is it so easy for us to have so many different languages? Because language has this nature where it is something that is really very directly developed out of human minds. And because that's the case, that kind of thing represents itself in variation. But you know, when you deal with mathematics, how many languages do you have? One. You have one. Now, you could come up with different symbols to express different concepts in mathematics, but you know, all of those concepts are exactly the same. Addition works the same, whether you speak English or some of those other 16 languages in India, right? No matter which language you are dealing with, addition works the same. Subtraction works the same. Multiplication works the same. Division works the same. Integration, derivation, everything in mathematics works the same, no matter where you are, no matter what human language you speak, no matter what your culture, it's one thing. Wow, how about that? Mathematics is something that is basically just one thing. One thing that we discover, that we don't invent. And so mathematics, in a way that's even above, the concepts of human languages, tells us that there is something conceptual behind the universe. There's something conceptual behind the structure and the fabric of everything, whether it's space and time, whether it's matter or energy. Behind everything, underlying everything, is a conceptual framework. Mathematics demonstrates this, mathematics reveals this, mathematics points to this, mathematics tells us that there is a mind of God behind everything. Now, the various relationships that we can express with numbers lead us to a great variation of things that we have discovered. I said that if you can apply a quantitative numerical concept to anything, you can treat it mathematically. We have discovered, of course, throughout the time, and I keep on using the word discovered because that's what it is. We haven't invented these things, we've discovered them. So we've discovered that you can use numbers to describe the differences between one line going from a circle to its center and another line going from the circle to the center, and you get all of the concepts that go into angles and trigonometry and geometry and all of those things. Oh, all of those conceptions are very helpful in understanding all kinds of things. Anything that spins, anything that twists or turns, all of that is basically treated by the fields of analytical geometry, trigonometry. Calculus, of course, comes into play. You can use calculus even on trigonomic functions, believe it or not. But all of this comes into play. Why? Well, because there is a concept behind all of these things. Angles tell us something about the mind behind all things that are made. There's a whole field of mathematics dealing with sets, combinatorials, all kinds of things along those kinds of lines. Some of the things that have made the news of late, I don't know if you've ever heard of Mandelbrot's set. It's all about the development and understanding. This is relatively fresh and new, coming out of the 80s, dealing with something called fractals. You probably have all heard about fractals, and if you haven't heard about them, I guarantee you've seen pictures that are developed from fractal mathematics. The Mandelbrot set is one such thing, and it's absolutely incredible. This thing registers numbers by 2 on the odd side, registers all the numbers on the other side of it. It shows you infinity because it's fractal. No matter how small it gets, it's there again. It's replicated smaller and smaller. So, if you think about tunneling into something infinitely, that's an awesome concept, but there are mathematical expressions for that kind of a thing. You can even treat something like infinity mathematically. It's quite astonishing, and a lot of this kind of thing deals with sets. Sets have to do with definition. What by definition belongs into this grouping and what by definition doesn't. And when you have various kinds of things that you run into in the world in which we live, you need that kind of a treatment to understand how the numbers involved with it relate to one another. We've discovered those things in mathematics. Equations, now that's the one that most of us are familiar with. All the equations that you have had to deal with when you were in school or in college. Equations is what it's all about. When you're a kid in junior high, you're getting stuck with all of these weird word problems. A train was going 500 miles east, and a robber was going 20 miles west. And they started from point A and point B. How long will it be before the robber hits the train, or the train hits the robber? That would be more unfortunate for the robber, I guess. Those kinds of things. Perhaps you remember algebra classes, and you're learning how to manipulate various kinds of equations. One of the most important skills needed in mathematics. You cannot manipulate equations You just don't get anywhere in mathematics. But I mean, there's just all kinds of ways to understand what equals what, and what is, dividing something, for instance, by 1. 1 doesn't have to look like a 1. There's actually, an infinite number of ways of expressing the number 1 in various kinds of equations. You stick that into a denominator, right? You're allowed to do that. You can divide by that quite easily and not do anything to the actual equation itself. And so all kinds of interesting things about mathematics in the field of equations. There too, did we invent those things? No, you're just fiddling around with those things and you discover them. It's like, wow, who knew this? Well, now I do, because I fiddled around with it and I discovered it. Virtually everything in mathematics has come that way. It wasn't invented. No one set out to come up with those definitions, with those rules, with those relationships, with those different kinds of powers. No one set out to actually establish those things. They just were fiddling around with numbers, and lo and behold, those kinds of things were discovered. All of this gets into the reality that mathematics is expressing something that is not dependent upon human minds. Human minds are the place where mathematics dwell, at least in the physical world, but human minds did not invent it, did not, if you will, put it into place. Mathematics was there in the world that God built, and human minds have the capacity to discover it. Now, virtually everything in the universe, everything, is describable in one way or another and understandable in one way or another through mathematics. You can go into the very small. You get into all that weird stuff we were talking about a couple of weeks ago. We were talking about the quantum froth and how when you get down to very, very, very small, inside of a Planck length, very small distances in the fabric of space and time, you discover that the nothingness that you would expect to be there is not quite nothingness. There's stuff going on. There's a certain frothiness about that, where things are popping into existence and popping out of existence. It's just this kind of roiling boil, if you will, going on at the very smallest nature of stuff. Quantum mechanics, it's such a weird and bizarre field. Not that many people can understand it. I know I look at it and I think this is the most counterintuitive stuff I've ever heard of. It's like goes whoosh right by me. But guess what we do with quantum mechanics? We express quantum mechanics by mathematics, and as a result of the mathematics that we are able to use, we're able to make the most accurate measurements of things like gravity that have ever been made. There are so many things that the understanding of them is brought into focus through the mathematics that can be applied to those fields. So whether you're dealing with something down there in what you would say infinitesimally small, or whether you're dealing with gigantic things, we are discovering, as we look with more clarity out into the broad expanse of the universe, there are humongous things going out there. Little spider-like gossamer threads of something, and those little threads seem to hold galaxies by the bunches in, and everything seems to, in one way or another, be affected by all of this stuff. And oh my goodness, we would look at it and just be filled with wonder. But the thing that leads to understanding is the fact that those things can be treated mathematically. And the relationships that exist between one thing and another thing become clarified through the use of mathematics. When you think about the power of mathematics to understand the universe, when you think about the reality that it exists quite apart from our invention or apart from our minds, when you think about the fact that mathematics is not something invented, it's something discovered, what does this all lead you to? I think it leads to this conclusion. that of all the things that we look at, mathematics is one of the best and the most prime examples that point exactly to the mind of a creator. That we have been put into this universe by someone who is conceptual, someone who is mindful, someone who is understanding. And mathematics, the existence of mathematics, is a demonstration and a proof of that thing. You know, some of the most brilliant mathematicians that we have right now on the planet are atheists. And the very thing that should speak to them and say, how can you even do this if there wasn't a mind before you that put it into place? But instead, you know, the pride of man, the willful ignorance of man, keeps people who should know better in the dark. We've talked over this time that we've been talking about some of these things, about some of the incredible things that exist in this universe that demonstrate, I think, beyond shadow of a doubt, if you're a sensible person, that God exists. And yet, some of the most brilliant minds that have ever lived, as far as we know, amongst humankind, stand in ignorance, totally blanked over, incapable of seeing the nose on the end of their face. And why is that so? Well, I'll tell you. When everything points to the existence of an all-powerful God sitting on a throne, ruling over us, there's just a lot of people who would rather sit in the throne themselves. They would rather be the only thing they have to be concerned with, the only thing that governs their life, their own whims, their own fancies, their own desires. They like being in control. And I tell you, sometimes I think this is true. The more intelligent a person is, the more they are susceptible to the pride of self. I see it over and over again. You know, when your brain works with facility and, you know, it's easy to do things, you gain a trust in yourself. It's an overweening trust. It doesn't bear up. I mean, there's plenty of places where all of us fail miserably or are left in the dark. And yet, boy, I tell you what, I don't know if great intelligence is a super gift or a super curse. Because it seems like if it was a super gift, those that were granted that gift would see the handiwork of God and with wonder fall down on their knees and praise the beauty, the wisdom, and the intelligence of their Maker. You know, sometimes I think that, you know, that with this great capacity of intellectual pride comes a remarkable level of blindness that is just mind-boggling. How can you look at the things that we've looked at? Whether you're looking at the wonder of just the existence of all this itself from nothing, or whether you're looking at something of the incredible inventiveness that exists within every single living cell, plant, animal, you, a parasite, whatever it might be. Every single cell. We're talking about numbers that boggle the mind. There's so many cells, and particularly so many cells that have lived throughout the existence of the universe itself. And inside of each and every one of them is a wonder that displays the majesty and the wisdom of God. How can you be a biologist that is aware of these things and not see that and be filled with wonder? Whether you're an astronomer looking out in the heavens, or you're a biologist looking into the depths of the cell, or you're a mathematician sitting around over a desk with a pencil in hand, figuring out numbers do all kinds of things that you didn't even realize when you sat down. How is it that these things don't lead to the conclusion I think they must, that there's a God over us? There's a God who's made us. There's a God who's in control. And all that we can do is, with the wonder that His creation fills us with, is bow down and praise His name.